We're in a
Yes,
quorum.
unanimous consent, the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Now, Mr. President, this morning, the Supreme Court struck down a Louisiana law that would have restricted abortion providers so severely that Louisiana would have been left with only a single clinic. These types of laws have popped up in state after state as a backdoor means of banning abortion, if not in law, then in practice, an insidious campaign to undermine the rights of women to make their own medical decisions. So today's ruling is a thunderbolt of justice for millions of American women who are at risk of having their constitutional rights invalidated by a reactionary state legislature, as there are many throughout the country. After surprising but very welcome rulings on DACA and LGBTQ rights 2 weeks ago, the Supreme Court once again made the right decision. The Supreme Court is entering Buffalo-Springfield territory. There's something happening here. Truthfully, today's ruling should not have been a surprise. The Louisiana law violated the court's precedent. In 2016, the court struck down a Texas law that was virtually identical to the one in Louisiana. The newest addition to the Supreme Court, however, despite promising the Senate he would respect precedent, dissented from the majority's ruling today. Justice Kavanaugh told senators he believed Roe v. Wade to be settled law, but in the very first ruling on a related issue, he decided that the court's precedent was wrong and Roe v. Wade could be greatly undermined. Thankfully, Kavanaugh's view was not in the majority. And today, America can breathe a sigh of relief that the Supreme Court kept the floodgates firmly shut against this particular attempt to nullify the landmark decision of Roe v. Wade. Now on Russia. On Friday, the New York Times and other media outlets reported that a Russian intelligence unit was offering Taliban-linked fighters bounties to kill American and coalition troops in Afghanistan. It should go without saying that it's our solemn obligation to support and protect our troops. If Russian intelligence is conducting a shadow campaign to sponsor the murder of American troops, there must be swift, strong, and unmistakable consequences for Putin and his cronies, something we should do in this NDAA bill. The New York Times reported that the Trump administration was aware of these activities as early as March of this year, and yet the Trump administration has authorized no retaliatory actions. Russia gives bounties to kill Americans. The administration does nothing. Donald Trump, you're not being a very strong president here, as usual. At the very least, you would expect the president and his team would want to get to the bottom of this. The president claimed, however, that, quote, nobody briefed or told me about this report. President Trump, you lose either way. If you weren't briefed on this important report, how can you run an administration where something this important is not brought to your level? And if you were told about the report and did nothing, that's even worse. Shame on you. Shame on you. A few hours ago, the White House press secretary said the president still has not received a briefing from the intelligence community about these reports. The White House chief of staff, meanwhile, is reportedly briefing Republican members of the House before the President of the United States gets a briefing. Is that amazing? He's the commander-in-chief. He's the one who's supposed to be protecting our soldiers. And they're still twiddling their thumbs instead of giving him a briefing, which, who knows, given his lack of respect for the truth, he may have received already and just denied it. So it raises many questions. First, is it true the president was not told this information? If so, why not? Was there a concern about sharing this information with the president? And the president doesn't seem as outraged as you would think he would be if, in fact, the intelligence community had this vital and important information and had not briefed him. Something doesn't smell right here, especially when we have a president and an administration who has a great deal of trouble telling the truth. We need answers, and we need them fast. So I am calling for the directors of national intelligence and the CIA to immediately brief all 100 senators on reports that Russia placed bounties on U.S. troops in Afghanistan. Among many other things, we need to know whether or not President Trump was told this information, and if so, when. Because there's been an alarming pattern in this administration dating back to its first days of appeasement towards authoritarian leaders, especially Vladimir Putin. President Trump stood next to Putin on the international stage and accepted his word over the word of our own intelligence agencies. President Trump has delayed or ignored congressionally mandated sanctions on Putin. The president has pondered withdrawing from NATO, the organization whose very purpose is to defend the free world from Vladimir Putin. Only a few months ago, the president mused about inviting Russia back into the G7. If we'd learned anything in the past 3 years, it's that President Trump is inclined to ignore or forgive Vladimir Putin's abuses on the international stage, even in the face of an attack on our democracy. If we learned anything in the last 3 years, it's that dictators, whether Xi or Putin or the head of North Korea, play President Trump for a fool and get the advantage over him every time. This means we all need to speak up right now and make sure that Congress and the executive branch is doing what's necessary to get to the bottom of these reports. The first step is a briefing for all 100 U.S. senators. Despite what some administration officials are claiming, no such briefing has been scheduled, and I'm not aware of any senator who's been invited to a White House briefing of any sort. Now, finally, on COVID-19. Unfortunately, COVID-19 continues to surge in several states. Florida, Texas, Arizona are reporting new highs in case numbers. Last Friday, there were 45,000 new cases nationwide, the most in a single day. As the public health crisis continues, our country is facing one of the greatest economic challenges since the Great Depression. Over 1/5 of the workforce has requested unemployment assistance. State, local, tribal governments are on life support and have laid off over 1.6 million workers. Our perennially underfunded schools are fighting an uphill battle to prepare for the fall. As Americans struggle to make rent payments and potential evictions, as our health care and child care systems face unprecedented burdens, Senate Republicans have been missing in action. Senate Republican equal MIA. Over a month ago, Leader McConnell said that Senate Republicans, quote, have yet to feel the urgency of acting immediately. Well, it seems like he really meant it. It's been nearly 3 months since we passed the CARES Act on a bipartisan basis, 96-0, and over 45 days since the House passed the HEROES Act, legislation that would deliver sorely needed resources to states, essential workers, American families, and our health care system. But Leader McConnell, excuse me, McConnell continues to say that Republicans, quote, need to assess the conditions in the country and insist that any future emergency relief bill be written in his office. Assess the conditions in the country when we have more unemployment than any time since the Great Depression, when a pandemic is killing tens of thousands of Americans monthly? Ignore that? Assess the conditions? And then for Leader McConnell to say the bill will be written in his office? Has he learned any lessons on COVID-2, COVID-3, COVID-3.5, the Justice in Policing Act? When you try to do something major on a partisan basis, nothing happens, and America desperately needs something to happen. Leader McConnell knows he has to negotiate if he wants to pass legislation. He's been around here a long time. He knows that. His refusal to engage in bipartisan talks on policing reform shows that maybe our Republican friends are not interested in passing bipartisan legislation. But that's what needs to happen. Bipartisan negotiations on policing reform and bipartisan negotiations on COVID. So this morning, Speaker Pelosi and I sent a letter to Leader McConnell urging him to join Democrats and sit at the negotiating table for the next round of COVID relief legislation. We're on the precipice of several deadlines. For millions upon millions of Americans, another rent payment is due this week. States are planning their budgets right now before the new fiscal year on July 1st. The emergency boost in unemployment will run out by the end of next month. So this week, Senate Democrats will force action on the floor on some of the most urgently needed measures to help working Americans, starting this evening, when Democrats will ask consent to pass crucial federal support for state, local, and tribal governments. I'll have more to say about this issue this evening, but I do want my Republican colleagues to hear the words of state and local officials across the country. Today, the Big Seven, the national associations representing governors, mayors, state legislatures, counties, and city managers, all bipartisan groups with many Republican members, coming from the deepest red states to the darkest blue, wrote the senator a letter pleading for federal support and warning of the dire consequences of delay. They write, these are the 7 organizations representing governors and legislatures and counties and towns and cities. Here's what they write. Previous federal bills responding to COVID-19 provided important support, yet none allow for the replacement of billions of lost revenues due to COVID-19. More robust and direct stimulus is needed for state and local governments to both rebuild the economy and maintain essential services in education, healthcare, emergency operations, and more, public safety, and more. Months have gone by, and our communities continue to suffer. Americans have a history of standing together in times of crisis and must do so now. Republican colleagues, please listen to those words. Leader McConnell, please listen. These are your own states are included here. They're demanding relief. To say we still don't see an urgent need, to say maybe we'll get around to it in a month, to say the legislation will be written in McConnell's office, all setting up for failure and the desperately needed lack of relief that America needs. I yield the floor.